Chinese President Xi Jinping reached deep into history to frame the future of U.S.-China ties as he met his U.S. counterpart Donald Trump yesterday.
President Xi warned against what's known as the Thucydides Trap, the idea that conflict can erupt when a rising power challenges an established one.
中美两国能不能跨越所谓的修昔底德陷阱，开创大国关系的新范式？能不能携手应对全球挑战，为世界注入更多的稳定性？能不能着眼两国人民的福祉和人类前途命运，共同开创两国关系的美好未来？这些可以说是历史之问、世界之问、人民之问。
The term Thucydides Trap comes from the ancient Greek historian Thucydides, who chronicled the devastating war between Athens and Sparta more than 2,000 years ago. Well, joining us this hour is the political scientist who popularized the term. His name is Allison. He's Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at the Harvard Kennedy School. Professor, thank you so much for joining us on the show. So let's talk about this term. The trap basically describes what happens when a prevailing power tries to prevent an emerging power from rising. So I'm wondering, is this an accurate description of what's happening right now between the US and China? Because we know this relationship has ebbed and flowed.
Oh, in a word, yes. I would say, even though it's surprising for, I think, many of your viewers, Thucydides, the founder and father of history, essentially nailed the issue. China, as certainly everyone in Singapore recognizes, is a meteoric rising power and has been so for the past generation, even longer. The U.S. is a colossal ruling power, and when a rapidly rising power seriously threatens the position of the established ruling power, typically the outcome is a catastrophic war. President Xi understands that point deeply, and I think he expresses it perfectly. President Trump, it may surprise you, appreciates this proposition as well. And the two of them have determined that they want to not be caught into the Thucydides trap, not to have this relationship spiral into a war the way it has typically done in other cases, but to do what President Xi calls create a new form of great power relations. And they began to do that in trying to articulate a different idea about the U.S.-China relationship in this summit. I think President Xi's lines, which President Trump then reiterated, is a constructive new stability, a new strategic stability. And that's easy to say, hard to do, but I'd say it's a step in the right direction.
It certainly is. And I mean, President Xi used this term before, but why do you think he chose this moment directly to President Trump at this high-stakes summit? What sort of message do you think he's trying to send here?
Well, I think as you played, and if people haven't looked at it, I would look at the whole his introductory comments. He tries to put this in big historical perspectives. He understands that these are the two most consequential countries in the world, that they're currently on a path that would normally, in terms of business as usual, if that's what they settle for, would produce history as usual. And history as usual would be a catastrophic war that neither China nor the U.S. would survive. So this is a huge idea, but I think an absolutely correct idea. As he said in the introductory comments, this is not just about one meeting. This is not just about one person. This is about the international security for the world. And I would say, right. And then is this a challenge for both parties, and especially the leaders of the two great states? Yes, it is. And is it one that they could stretch their way to find some way to try to help reshape and reframe a relationship in which it is? I mean, there's really two big ideas here that are, because they're somewhat contradictory, make it difficult, I think, for all of us to deal with it. On the one hand, structurally, the U.S. and China are bound to be fierce rivals. The U.S. likes being number one. The U.S. believes that as the world leader, it's actually created an international security order that's been to the benefit of all of us. I mean, this is 80 years without a great power war. This is the longest period without great power war since the Roman Empire. So, and it's produced greater well-being for everybody in the world, including Singapore, than previous periods in their history. So that's an American point of view. And on a Chinese point of view, China has risen to be now a peer competitor with the U.S. and deserves a bigger place in the world, a bigger place in the sun. Actually, Lee Kuan Yew had a pretty good picture of this in his own mind. And I think, as he said, the challenge then would be, given that there's on the one hand a rivalry, and on the other hand, the two countries are so entangled in the world that we're living in today with nuclear weapons, with a enclosed biosphere, with AI, with economic entanglement, that the two parties are going to have, in Lee Kuan Yew's word, he said, find a way to share the Pacific in the 21st century. Well, that's not going to be easy, but I would say this is a start in the right direction.
So, Professor Allison, you're a political scientist, but you're also, a bit of a historian. So what typically happens when an existing power tries to stop an emerging power? What does history tell us about how this tends to play out if one is not careful, I suppose?
Well, thank you. So I wrote a book about this called Destined for War. Can the U.S. and China escape Thucydides Trap? This was published in 2017, just as President Trump became president. So it was not about President Trump per se. It was about the underlying structural facts as they are exhibited by the U.S. and China today. In the book, I look at the last 500 years. We find 16 times a rising power seriously threatens a ruling power. 12 of those cases end in war. 4 in no war. So it would obviously be wrong to say war is inevitable. Would not be wrong to say war is likely. And then we can look at the cases and say what went wrong in the cases that went wrong and what went right in the cases that went right. A very interesting case that went right was the Cold War, the rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. It's called war, but it's not really a war. It was cold, that is, without bombs and bullets. And how was that managed? Well, ultimately, in the nuclear arena, the two parties recognized that given that they had equal capabilities for destroying the other, they were going to have to find some way to live together. That was ultimately called détente. That didn't mean they didn't continue to struggle, but it did mean that they avoided the confrontations that would have led them to a war. If you could contrast that with what happened in 1914, after Germany rose and challenged Great Britain, where something then as bizarre as the assassination of an archduke in Yugoslavia, or Sarajevo, ended up being a spark that produced a fire that created a conflagration that essentially destroyed all of Europe. So we've got a lot to learn from history about both how neglect produces bad results, but how thoughtful policy can do better. Yeah.
So Professor Allison, I mean, my next question would be, have the people in Washington, D.C. read your book? Are they cognizant of how this might play out?
Well, I think certainly some of them have. A number of them are people that I've known for a long time. I don't know how big a reader President Trump is, but I know that his family includes some serious readers who have read the book and have interesting ideas about it. And certainly the people that he knows and works with have done. So this is not an idea foreign to him, and certainly not to Secretary Rubio or to Secretary Hegseth or to the people in the intelligence community. I think if you look at to examine the ways in which both President Xi on the one hand and President Trump have been trying to find a way to articulate what would be a new form of great power relations is quite interesting. They each have looked for metaphors. President Xi has said recently that we might even have to be co-pilots of the great ship of state. Well, that's a pretty big idea, that the two of us in this together and we might have to be co-pilots. President Trump actually offered even a more intriguing sort of suggestion when, after he had met with President Xi the last time, he came back and he said, you know, we could continue this struggle in the hope that we would knock the Chinese out, or they might try to knock us out. But actually, I think we could do better than that by essentially trying to figure out whether together we might produce something even better than either of us could produce in our own terms. So one kind of metaphorical conception here would be to think about the Olympics. Could the U.S. and China relationship for the next 50 years be something like, the Olympics, in which obviously as an American, I would like for us to win all the gold, and the Chinese would like to win all the medals. But, you know, parties run, they do their best. They engage in what we call healthy competition. Actually, you and I run faster if we're running against each other and competing. So competition is not a bad thing. And if over 50 years it turns out that the Chinese system performs more effectively than the American system, well, we'll see. I don't believe so. If the American system ends up performing better than the Chinese system, well, we'll see. So let history decide, I would say.
Yeah, how would you advise then that the U.S. government, what can Mr. Trump do to minimize the possibility of a conflict and war? Is the onus totally on Washington right now, or can China play its own part as well?
I'd say both. On both sides. I think that in the U.S.-China relationship, obviously the hottest of the hotspots and the one most dangerous is Taiwan. And there, obviously, you can think of a half dozen ways in which something could go wrong on that front. I think President Xi and President Trump, this is not they've been in regular communication through both phone calls and letters over the first 15 months of the administration, since inaugural, or since the election, when President Xi called President Trump. And they've talked candidly and privately about Taiwan and the risk that some event, maybe a provocation in Taiwan by some more radical move towards independence, or some accident or incident, because the operations of both American and Chinese military forces in the Taiwan Straits run the risk of collisions all the time. So they've talked about the ways in which that could trigger a spiral that would end up producing a war. And I think have communicated with each other that they're going to try to be sure that no other party drags them into a war that they don't want to choose. And they've made it very clear with each other and with all of their colleagues that they do not want a war with the other party, because they understand that would ultimately be catastrophic for themselves. Right. So I think that they're working on that issue. I think what they will say publicly as compared to what would they say and discuss privately there'll be a pretty big gap.
Professor Allison, we do have to leave it there. Unfortunately, we thank you so much for your fascinating insights. Graham Allison is Douglas Dillon Professor of Government at the Harvard Kennedy School.